Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Forum on Russian, European, and U.S. Security. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Golfo Alexopoulos. I'm a professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies and director of the Institute on Russia at the University of South Florida, and I will be your moderator for today's discussion. This conversation on the strategies for combating disinformation is the third session of a four-part series that runs at this time every Wednesday through the month of February as part of the Forum on Russian, European, and U.S. Security. The forum is a partnership between the the USF Institute on Russia, and the J3 International Division at U.S. Special Operations Command. Our goal is to bring an international group of academic and military professionals together for a public conversation on timely and critical issues in global security. I want to remind everyone that the video recording of sessions 1 on the history and challenge of Russian disinformation and sessions 2 on social media and the Russian disinformation ecosystem are both available on the USF Institute on Russia's website, and this one will be too. The mission of the USF Institute on Russia is to advance knowledge and understanding of Russia and the surrounding region through interdisciplinary research, area studies, and global partnerships. I want to say thank you to our generous supporters and to those at SOCOM and USF whose hard work made this inaugural forum possible. It's now my pleasure to introduce my collaborator on the forum, Bill Flesser, who will introduce our exceptional panel of experts for today's discussion. Bill Flesser is Deputy Director of the J3 International Division at SOCOM. He's served in the U.S. Army for 22 years, primarily in Special Forces, retiring as a Deputy Director for Operations, Special Operations Command, Europe. He earned master's degrees from the National War College and Cornell University, and he is the recipient of the Joint Civilian Service Achievement Medal and the Joint Meritorious Civilian Service Medal. Bill, over to you.
Dr. Alexopoulos, thank you very much. And again, welcome to everybody and want to extend and double down on Golfo's thanks to everybody who helped to make this happen. These have been great for us so far in terms of exchange of ideas about a critical security topic. And again, here at the SOCOM J3 International Branch, we host 20 representatives from 26 nations who are here to help us understand and develop strategies for common security issues like this. So I'm incredibly proud to be a part of this effort, and I'm also very happy to introduce our panelists today. First of all, Dr. Kathleen M. Carley, PhD from Harvard, is a computational social scientist who has served on numerous National Academy panels. Her research employs dynamic network analysis and social cybersecurity techniques to address questions related to complex social technical issues such as counterterrorism, disinformation, and organizational design. She is the developer of the Aura tool for high-dimensional network analysis, Bend Analytics, and NetMapper for text mining. Also with us today is Thomas Kent, a specialist on Russian disinformation and the former president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. He teaches at Columbia University and consults on disinformation issues for governments, militaries, non-governmental organizations. He's the author of the book, Striking Back, Overt and Covert Options to Combat Russian Disinformation, which has been published just last September by the Jamestown Foundation. Also today, I'd like to introduce a member of the J3 International here at US SOCOM. Colonel Jaroslav, also known as Jerry Jablonski, has been a member of the Polish Special Forces since 2002. He received his master's from defense analysis from the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School in 2009 and has a PhD in information and knowledge management in 2012. Colonel Jablonski has combined more than 40 months of deployment in the Balkans, Operation Iraqi Freedom, Afghanistan, and support for the International Security Force. You can hear him in the background because Jerry's right over my shoulder, so we're getting a little bit of feedback. At present, he serves as the Deputy Director and Chief of Staff here at the J3 International branches. hugely helpful to us in running this enterprise. So, Dr. Alexopoulos, back over to you, and let's get this session rolling because it has potential to be very interesting and very informative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that the views and opinions expressed in this discussion are those of the participants and don't necessarily reflect the official position of their respective institutions. The format today is that we'll begin with a moderated discussion, followed by questions from the audience. When you submit your questions, could you please let us know whether you're an international guest or a student, and this way we can select a cross-section of questions from our diverse audience. So we'll cover a range of topics today, from the ethical, practical, and scientific challenges that we face in combating disinformation to the various entities that are responsible for detecting and countering disinformation in different ways. But let's begin with a very basic question, and I'll address it to all of you. What are some of the tools and strategies that the West has deployed to combat Russian disinformation? And Kathleen, please get us started.
All right, thank you. So some of the tools basically amount to identifying a disinformation campaign and then trying to counter it with truth. And the problem with that is that, of course, facts often do not help you convince people that the disinformation is incorrect. This is often done by analysts who well-meaning, but they survey lots of social media, and they basically take the find the magic tweet approach. Then they will send out accurate information as a refute. Indirectly, though, another strategy that is being used is to employ third-party actors, groups like Anonymous and so on, to actually find different kinds of trolls, et cetera, and disinformation, and then to get those actors and that information banned from the various platforms. Boutique tools are also used. These are developed by individual soldiers like the operations research people. But there are also a large number of other tools that are under development and that are used in some groups and not in others. Things like Pulse and Aura and so on. And there's a whole range of these technologies that try to analyze social media and use anomaly detection and other things to try to begin to find the disinformation.
Thank you. Jerry?
Thank you, Golfo. From my perspective, I would say there are plenty of different tools right now implemented around the world how to mitigate the Russian disinformation. I can talk even 30 minutes about that, but let me summarize for only a couple examples. Because for the last 20 years, I work in international environment. I want to give a couple examples. First of all, let's say what right now is the Sweden, very solid nation, one of the Nordic nations. After the huge campaign against them, we have the very comprehensive approach. I mean, all the departments working against the disinformation, not dedicated one department in the government who's responsible for this, but we have very, very comprehensive approach, interagency approach. In terms of the UK after the dealing with the problem with the malign activity from the Russia in 2016, just before election, I mean the decision to move outside the UK, European Union, we built some kind of dedicated national security communication unit. In terms of the France, for instance, we're dealing with the Russian as well, and we try to build restrictions against any kind of flowing of the money from banks to banks in order to mitigate the funding for the disinformation campaign. Generally speaking, Russia is targeting at least 24 nations across globe. Frankly speaking, 80% of them are in European theater. So there are plenty of different tools to mitigate this. The basic point, the bottom line is we have to maintain this, and we have to not mitigate our approach, and we have to even strengthen this kind of approach. Even we can reach in some places some kind of tipping points against Russia, but this is the price which we want to be still living in the free world. And finally, from in Poland, we are implement many different tools, but we are looking for the Swedish model, where we have to take all the comprehensive approach against Russian disinformation. Of course, all the new technology, purely and well information our society. This is the key to mitigate the Russians' disinformation right now. This is at the beginning from my side.
Thank you, Jerry. Tom, do you also see a comprehensive approach? What are some of the tools and strategies that have been used?
Well, I see a lot of tools and strategies. I'm not sure I see a comprehensive approach in many places, but certainly the tools include much better exposure of Russian operations than we've ever had before. We see them for what they are. We identify them quickly. And a lot of this work is done by non-government actors, which we can talk about later because they're so important in this struggle. There has been a substantial increase in media literacy training in schools, also for older people, which is important. The fact-checking community, the international fact-checking community, has grown geometrically in the past few years. It's a huge group of people now who are checking facts, pointing out disinformation. Action by social networks, they have gotten much better at identifying inauthentic activity and taking it down. It took them quite a while to find their footing, but they're better now than they were before, even though the task is enormous. And some countries have been taking very direct action against disinformation by one country or another, including Russia. Ukraine just banned several television networks, shut them down essentially in Ukraine from broadcasting. We have seen the UK issue a big fine, I think it was more than $100,000 against RT for what they found was a lack of balance in their coverage of Syria and some other things. In the United States, there's talk about perhaps taking some action against RT and Sputnik, not simply because of their content, not mainly because of their content, but because Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is under very heavy pressure in Russia and being restricted and fined and so forth. So maybe people are saying in the idea, in the concept of reciprocity, there should be some kind of action against RT and Sputnik. There are a lot of questions around that, but I just mentioned blocking or limiting the access to populations of Russian broadcasters is one thing that the West has tried and continues to try.
So how would you assess some of these strategies? And Tom, I'd like to follow up with you and then ask the others as well. We do have a lot of tools available from what you all have described. There are lots of different ways that we can combat disinformation. Could you now offer your assessment of what you think works, what doesn't? What are the limits of the efficacy of some of these tools and strategies? Tom?
Well, yeah, we've listed an awful lot of tools, and I guess the answer would be, so how's that working out for us? It's not really working out for us because we continue to identify Russian disinformation as a threat to our society. So what's the problem here? I think to begin with, media literacy does not deal with the impulse to share things that you agree with. People may know that something is not true, but they share it anyhow, or they don't bother checking it just because it's too delicious. I think exposure and fact-checking, all this work that's being done in these areas, is not getting to the most vulnerable people. What's happening is that there are, and this is true in the United States, this is true in East Europe, that people who are concerned about Russian disinformation or disinformation at all are in somewhat of a bubble, and they talk to each other. So we do not have a real effort to reach ordinary people in ordinary language to really combat these things. I think we tend to be fairly polite. We tend to be fairly genteel. We feel that taking the gloves off is something that we don't really do, and here we are.
Thank you. Jerry, would you agree that we don't take the gloves off enough? What has been your experience in Poland?
Thank you very much. I'm very glad that I have the chance to meet in one panel with Mr. Kent, because it looks like that you works as the chief of the Radio for Liberty and the Free Europe, helped grow me up and build the solidarity in Poland. So I'm the kid of the solidarity. I grew up in the communist country, so I know the true language and from the broadcasting from the Radio Free Europe in the later 70s, 80s helped us to survive the communist time and build our strength and our way to independent. But back to your questions, Golfo. I think that all the tools and strategies which we have right now is a very good way change because we have to adopt or serve quicker than the Russia changing our approach against us. So generally speaking, we have to, whenever we have all the basket of the tools or the strategy, all the kit of the tools against disinformation, we have to review them, plan against them quickly and quicker than Russia are doing disinformation against us. We cannot be reactive. We have to be proactive. We cannot just like Mr. Ken said. We are. My personal opinion is that in our broadcasting and our messaging, we are pretty much too polite. I understand we have the foundation of this approach is our democracy, our ethic approach, but frankly speaking, Russians have the different ethics. We have the different approach. And you as the subject matter expert about Russia, you probably understand this just like me. We have no polite cooperation with Russia. We significantly increase attack on our society. I mentioned 24 nations, but probably there are more. So everything we have to do, we have to maintain changing our strategies and the tools faster and learn faster than the Russian. And we don't look at behind, and we have to look forward because we have the good examples how to doing how you did this during the Ronald Reagan presidency, how to dealing with the Russia. Again, quick approach and quick reaction, not know the standby position against the Russia. We have to be always proactive against them.
Thank you, Jared. Kathleen, what is your assessment of some of the various tools and strategies that are available for combating disinformation?
So in my view, currently there's two main classes of things. One of these are the ones that do fact checking in a more forensic by hand perspective. It's done by a lot of people, it's crowdsourced, but it still doesn't scale to the rate of information that is disinformation that is out there. I mean, like in COVID alone, there were over 7,000 different disinformation lines. Machine learning tools, which is another approach, typically take too long to train, tend to be focused on a single language or single social media platform and so on. And so they don't scale. I mean, disinformation is a global phenomena, a multi-language phenomena, multi-platform, and most of our tools are only designed for one language, for one country, for one platform. The other final thing I would say is that a lot of the tools right now are also limited by the amount of information that they can process at a time. It often takes much longer to identify that something is disinformation or to counter it than it does to create it in the first place. It can take minutes to create, but it can take weeks, months, years to find. And so those are some of the big limitations that we see out there.
I'd like to follow up on this and ask you, researchers, you mentioned that it takes a long time for researchers to do this forensics and identify disinformation campaigns. Do you think that there's a way to detect it in real time? Is the science really far from doing this, from achieving this?
It's still pretty far. We're getting much better at detecting things that are inaccurate facts. Okay, they're just out and out thing. But the trouble is, most disinformation, a lot of the conspiracy theories are not inaccurate facts. Things that allow you to be closer to real time are to crowdsource it, to being prepared for events where you know it's going to occur and watch for it, like we've done around various movies and things, or around NATO exercises. You know there's going to be there'll be many Russian disinformation campaigns. The other thing that helps is running continual anomaly detection, but you have to keep monitoring your data all the time to do this, and that's very expensive and beyond the capabilities of many groups. And the other one is tracking the so-called fake news sites. These are a set of online locations, websites, etc., that are disproportionately used to become the bearer of a lot of the disinformation. And I should say, similarly, tracking and monitoring state-sponsored accounts out of Russia is also equally important, particularly in certain parts of the world.
Thank you. So Tom, I'd like to turn to you and ask if you could please talk about some of the obstacles that we face in dealing with Russian disinformation. There are ethical challenges, practical, scientific challenges. Could you please describe some of the more prominent challenges in your view to combating Russian disinformation effectively?
Sure. Well, the first thing is that we are willing to expose disinformation. Kathleen pointed out all the problems in doing that, but we are willing to do it, which is a good thing. We've gotten to that point. Although we do seem to have a problem with calling out disinformation actors in any loud way that reaches ordinary people, back to what I was saying before. But in any case, we do identify disinformation and write articles in the Washington Post which scare each other about it. I've written it myself, I must say, but it's not getting out to lots of people. But more important, I don't think that this conflict is going to be won just by shooting down disinformation. It has to be won by advancing our own values and talking about values of democracy and free speech and so forth. But there's a great reluctance to do that for fear that we will be labeled propagandists. How it somehow happened that saying patriotic things that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, everyone just said is now considered propaganda, I'm not sure. But in any case, the idea of going forth with aggressive statements in favor of the way we live and the way we want to live is kind of out of fashion here. I'm not talking about doing our own disinformation, but just speaking bluntly about what we see as value in our own societies. And of course, we have this great lack of faith in our own societies these days. Who are we to preach? Look at all the things that are wrong in our society. But the key element in my mind is that we are not preaching democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and so forth to other countries because America does it so well, or because we want them to be like America. It's because we think it would do well in their societies, and we want to support people in those societies who feel that way. So, Americans did not invent a free press. So it's important to suggest that we are advancing here universal values that are not some kind of ideological sabotage from us.
Jerry, do you agree? Do you think that in the Cold War we were more effective at messaging some of the values of Western society? Is that what you would identify as? Would you identify this as one of the challenges moving forward?
Yes, Golfo, I identify almost the same point. Again, I agree with the post-communist country, fortunately free right now. So during the Cold War, I was the kid or the teenager, but in 70s, 80s, we live in many generations in one big house in the village. So we could perceive all the information around us and we analyze them. Many times I hear the discussion between the elders, especially after the Saturday broadcasting from the Radio Free Europe when all this broadcasting was jamming by the Soviet stations, radio stations, and we still have the chance to hear this in the remote hide places. But what can help us to survive? We didn't perceive 100% information which we get from the West. We took then our expertise or the knowledge older generation who remember the Second War, who remember the genocide made by the Soviets secret police in Poland, and we tried to find the golden middle message for us and build our opinion what's going on around us. Of course, that was pretty much close what the West sent to us by the broadcasting or by the by smuggled books to our homes, which was distributed by the Catholic Church in Poland. But we maintain our situation awareness based on the broadcasting. Books from this, which were smuggled from the West, newspapers from the West, and what we see on our eyes around us. So that kind of approach helped us to keep our resistance against the communists. I think that what I want to say about the Westerner approach, mainly about the U.S. approach, I think that the United States at that time have a very solid grand strategy. Very solid one. When I mentioned before the Ronald Reagan presidency, that was the very, from my opinion, when I was the kid, I remember that the strategy was pretty much support all the broadcasting or the distribution of the books to post-communist countries. Again, that was a very solid one, comprehensive approach against one enemy. Of course, now world is still different for United States and his allies, because it's not only the Russia but also the China and all the not state actors who try to minimize the U.S. Superpower role in the world. But one more time, I think there are plenty of lessons learned from the Cold War, which we can implement to contemporary world. Even we have the now information age with all the new tools to for information. You know, in the communist time, we have the TV, newspapers, and the books, or the radio. Now we have the plenty of different tools, including the social media. But again, one single, no, one united coalition approach against threat like the Russia can help us to mitigate this problem, because Russia have the problem as well. You know, that we can talk about this in different panel, different sessions.
Thank you, Jerry. Kathleen, you did mention some of the obstacles scientifically that some researchers confront. Do they confront any other obstacles bureaucratically, practically? I mean, what other challenges do you see?
Well, I mean, some of the other challenges have to do with the way the data platforms themselves let you collect and share data, and the way they are constantly changing what data is even available, and constantly, and then calling you and say, well, you can't publish on this now because we've removed it from our platform. So it's making it hard, scientifically to show, very clear results when the data is constantly in flux. It's hard for replication. There's also practical problems in terms of getting the latest technologies and things out into the hands of the end users, like into the militaries or whatever, right? There's problems with getting things accredited. There's problem with the soldiers may not have the right affordances to use the tools that to collect the kind of data that researchers can collect and use. So those are some of the other practical problems in this area.
I'd like to follow up with another question for you, Kathleen. You're one of the main practitioners of this new field of social cybersecurity. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about it. How does this emerging field help us to detect and assess disinformation? Sure.
So social cybersecurity is a new emerging computational social science that basically is both a science and an engineering. So it has a very applied focus for keeping people ability to interact online without undue threatening influence. So it's like hacking the person as opposed to hacking computers. And some of the new things that are coming out of it are tools and techniques for identification, for following, for identifying not just who is doing what when, but why are they doing it. So intent analytics, that's like some of the new bend analytics and things like that. But also teaching critical thinking at scale would be another one, new training programs in this particular area, and countermeasure analysis. Like, how can we actually counter it? So like building simulation tools to actually test out different rules of operation and see which ones really work and which ones don't. Those are some of the things.
Great. Tom, I'd like to turn to you about how the United States can work with non-government actors. When you were head of VOA and afterwards, you had a lot of exposure to the way in which non-government actors within Russia themselves are both the victims of disinformation and they counter disinformation effectively, independent journalists and so on. How can the West work with these third parties, and how can we do that without harming them?
Well, first of all, I should say I was at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, not VOA, but close enough.
My apologies.
They're sister. It's okay. They're sister networks. Well, I think that non-government actors have shown themselves to be very effective in fighting disinformation. We see them gathering a lot of open source intelligence that has exposed a lot of secret Russian military and intelligence operations, illicit money transfers, disinformation centers. We know most of what we know about the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg due to reporting by Russian journalists. We have seen, particularly in East Europe, non-government organizations actually out there on social networks fighting Russian trolls, penetrating and disrupting conspiracy chat rooms, running hoaxes against Russian soldiers. I think that on the whole, what these non-government actors need is not really inspiration. They don't need to be told what freedom is. They know that. They need training. They need scale. And they need what I refer to as back shops, which is to say Western organizations that will provide 24/7 support, technical support, advice, help in monitoring the information environment, advertising tools and techniques that they need to have. As for non-government actors inside Russia, indeed, one has to be careful because the Russians have created this whole web of foreign agent laws that makes it very hard to visibly transfer any kind of financial resources to them. But from outside, their messages can be amplified. Journalists inside Russia can be invited to join international reporting projects, projects like the OCCRP corruption projects. Russian publications actually have been involved in those, and that can continue. So there is a great commonality of interest with non-government actors inside Russia too.
Jerry, I'd like to follow up on this point. Are non-government actors working with the Polish military or Polish government to combat disinformation? Are you working with civil society as well?
Yes, definitely. Yes, Golfo. I can confirm this. No, nobody had to convince Poles to stand up against the Russians. We have the more than 600 years history to struggle with this neighbor. So in terms of the not government organization, we have the our MOD have the different process to select and the screening this kind of organization in order to work with our military departments or units to mitigate the disinformation from the Russia. Of course, because I would say like this that sometimes not government organization reach the high level of effectiveness. I would say like this quicker than all the bureaucracy who is around the government, I would say, organization. So we can fill up the gaps, and just like I said at the beginning, comprehensive approach, military civilian approach. Every nation, if follow this kind of rules, can build the effective system. If we extend this for the multinational approach against Russia, that would be even more effective. So what we're doing in the NATO SOF or the outside the NATO, for instance, here in the US-SOCOM, we try to learn to each other how to mitigate Russia disinformation by using the military and non-military approach, by military and not government organization. Of course, nations have the different level of efficiency, but trust me, some of them have very well developed tools or subsystems or system which we can learn being here in US-SOCOM for a couple of years and sharing with our home station. That's pretty much what I want to say in this point.
Thank you. I think we will turn to questions in a few moments. I want to encourage our audience to submit your questions, but before we do that, I want to ask everyone what you would propose as the most effective response and the most as the most effective remedies or responses. You've mentioned several. If you could just, what would be your top two? Kathleen, if you can start.
So I think that one of those would be basically putting in more support for social cybersecurity teams in every institution, every government group, every corporation, et cetera, that are actually trained for how to identify and combat this, so that you spread it throughout, and so that people are then practicing better hygiene, social, disinformation hygiene, basically. The other one would be to see if we could actually alter the underlying technology so that the information or any image or information set has a completely has a watermark on it that cannot be altered, changed, etc. So always know its pedigree, like where did it come from, who sent it, etc. Would be my top two.
Thank you. Jiri, what would be your top two?
My top two would be, first of all, we have to keep the network, international network, under the solid strategy against the Russian disinformation. And we have to keep behind the head that the Russian disinformation or threat widely, this is the wicked problem. We cannot minimize this to the zero level. It will exist in we only can mitigate this. But in order to mitigate this effectively, we have to have this solid multinational cooperation under US leading role or the NATO umbrella or wider. And we cannot look at for the strategy just like we are looking for our national defense strategy. I will give you the example. Everybody reading national defense strategy, I'm not talking about the US, but I'm talking every single one, only when it's published, maybe more than 12 months later. And additionally, some of the agency is looking at this strategy only not by whole, by only the piece, not for the all as the good guidebook. So the point number one, international network, including the military and the non-military, not government organization, who can work together against the disinformation. And the number two is education of the next generation. We cannot blame them that are 21st century generation who can only addicted for the technology. We have to build them just like we built in the SOF, our creativity, emotional intelligence, active learning with the growth mindset, leadership skills. Because this generation, when I see in Poland, even we're addicted for the sophisticated devices like the mobile phones or the tablets, we have the very good mindset to just only need the stimulation to using this against the disinformation. So we perceive technology very quickly. So we have to invest for our next generation. Don't use in the school marks, for instance, for D to A, because just like in military, we're using go or no go. If somebody the next generation have to know how to find the solution, not to pass the exam for the B or C. It doesn't make sense. We have to have approach to figure out the quick problem. Let's say with the small Russian disinformation on the eastern Ukraine or the against the Lithuania, which is the permanent issue right now. It's pretty much two basic points from my side.
Mhm. Thank you. And Tom, what would be on your wish list, top two remedies?
The first would be get on the air, do our own communicating in a much more organized and effective way than we do now. Let them hold webinars worrying about us. It seems to be sort of in one direction here. They seem to be operating relatively freely, doing anything they want with very few consequences. And we are, on the whole, I would say, in a defensive mode. And so, maybe we should be more offensive, again, with truth, but the truth can be stated much more assertively and much more effectively than it is now. And the second on the list would simply be to do a lot of the above through non-government actors. I don't think that government officials, Yaroslav has pointed this out, that government officials are often the most nimble, most effective people in communicating. There are plenty of non-government Western and local organizations that can do this work if they get the proper support.
Thank you. We're going to turn now to questions. I see quite a few questions here. So we'll start with a student from USF. Can you discuss a specific campaign identified recently in the United States? And do you find that big tech has been cooperative in combating disinformation? Kathleen, you mentioned big tech, so I'll hand this over to you. If anybody else wants to comment.
Big tech, it's not necessarily in their interests to actually be really effective at countering disinformation, in part because the same technologies that are used to spread disinformation are used for marketing, and promoting, services and so on, and that's how they make their money. I would say that they have their approach, which has been kind of like a whack-a-mole approach, kind of hit or miss, let's take out some things, has been marginally effective. However, when they remove certain disinformation, it just goes to another platform and then reappears. So without consistent guidelines across all of them, it's ineffective. The other thing is if they label stuff as disinformation and just leave it up, that has actually been shown to actually promote the spread of disinformation if that disinformation is coming from a celebrity. So no, not particularly, but I think they are very concerned and trying to find guidance and rules on, I think, some guidance and things for them they'd be willing if it doesn't cut into their bottom line.
Thank you. Does Jerry or Tom, would you like to comment on the social media companies? No. Okay, we'll move on then to international law. Is there a role for international law in combating disinformation? Tom, do you want to tackle that one?
I wish there were, but I don't think so. I don't know how you can regulate speech. This is a core American concept of not regulating speech. Some countries try to do it in different ways. You can do it at the edges, but it's very, very hard to imagine the key countries involved in the world's information environment agreeing on what would be acceptable and not, and then sticking to it. And let's remember that not only the West, but Russia has a lot of non-government actors that work for them. So, you know, the Russians could say, hey, you know, we observed the treaty in some way, but we can't be responsible for, you know, the for this website and that website that that are aligned with our interests.
Thank you. Jerry, I'll give this question to you. How do you message Western values to segments of society that, for whom those are not obvious human values?
Golfo, you know that first of all, all the Westerner message have to be spread across the Russian society in a very careful manner. I am not the technical expert about it, but is the different perception of the message from the West, people who living on the countryside in Russia, and people who living in the city, and people who leading this country. So the perception of the Westerner message, I mean the messaging system have to be allocated, depends of the Russian construct of a society. As everybody know, the Russian big weakness is the lack of the well-developed middle class society. We have the very rich people and people who, maybe this is the wrong expression, but we're living from first month to another first of the day of the month. So we have the more than 80 different nationality, more than all the Europe together. So the messaging from the West have to be targeted a little bit different for the people who leading this country, who living in the big cities and the towns, and people who living outside the city and the towns. Even right now, the Russians have the more than 80% access for the internet. I think the perception of the message of the West is different, depends on the level of the society.
Yeah, I think that's very important to understand the segmentation of Russian society. And the Russians have understood that very well in the US. A lot of people say, gee, I never see any of this Russian stuff in my Twitter feed. And that's because they're not targeting you. They know who's who, and we can know who's who there. The same tools can be used.
Kathleen, do you want to comment on this, or I'll move to another question for you?
Just move on.
Yes. So the next question is about curriculum, and it's from a student who says, you know, the curricula at universities change at this glacial rate. How can students learn about these threats that are out there, and in order to cope when they're not being taught this at the universities? And I could follow up and just ask you, how do you teach it too? So if you can handle some of the problem and how you address it.
So first off, well, at least at our university and many others that I've been at, it's only the core courses that change glacially. There's usually electives, and the electives are where you would go to get, because those usually pop up every year as new ones every year. Secondly, groups like ours run special summer institutes or special summer programs that actually teach this information. That we have students coming to those from all over the globe. And so that's another way, is to look for these kind of summer programs outside of your own institution. Then the other thing is that join, you know, societies and go to the conferences, because you will see a lot of the new information at those conferences. How do we teach it? Well, first off, we teach new things on the technology and stuff itself in the classes. We also run special seminars, and we bring in speakers from all over the place for weekly seminars as a way of making sure that what we're teaching to our students is not just our institutional view, and that it has a broader perspective. And next, we get students involved in hands-on projects so that they can actually take part in the whole process, the identification, and can understand hands down, you know, how hard this is as a problem, and and it helps them get better at doing it. We also teach critical thinking, and we also teach how to monitor social media using real social media analytic tools as opposed to fake tools, which a lot of so it's like role game playing, but with real tools. Yeah.
Wow. Jerry, how is Poland teaching young people about disinformation and influence operations?
Before I answer to your question, I want to say that how the SOF, Special Operation Forces, train people to with the disinformation. I cannot explain many details, but I can say that because most of the SOF around the world people are selected with the different kind of background, different kind of educations. So we have the national or the international under NATO, or we send the students to the United States for different I call it this culture understanding programs, in order to understand Russian culture, because this is the key. For Poles, it's a little different. It's easier to understand Russian because we are the same. I would say the same language group. I would say to some degree the same. Maybe this is not proper word, tribe. But back to the international SOF. So we try to use the people with the wide, good mindset to learn how the Russian culture looks like and how it's developed, and what is the pros and cons dealing with this kind of culture. And to answer to your question, in Poland, we don't learn in Poland about the Russia we learn people about the Russia as the threat, but not to make the we don't add additional wrong meaning for this. I would say like that we try to, what I said at the beginning, that we try to learn kids by the creative approach and team working and selection of the information, talk with to compare this information with different sources, and not to believe what we see on the TV. If we they have access for the Russian broadcasting, in order to have the common point. Probably this kind of education is not different than in the countries around the Poland with our neighbors on the West Europe. The most important thing is that we try to present our history, not only our point of view in history with the Russia, but also how the Russia look for us, because otherwise we have the only one single point of view.
Tom, what would you say about training young people about this?
Well, I think that it ought to be a fairly attractive subject, and Kathleen pointed out that there are electives on this subject, and I think that since everyone is so wrapped up in social media, it should be attractive, and it's important for universities, I think, even high schools, to offer perhaps short courses, because maybe not everyone can devote one of their 4 or 5 courses they take a semester to this. But short courses, 3-month courses, that kind of thing. And there's certainly no lack of material. The Stony Brook University, for example, has an enormous website of curricula and videos and so forth on the subject that anybody can download and use. So there's plenty of material, and I would think a reservoir of student interest.
Thank you. So the next question, do you think let's see, what would you say to smaller countries of the former Soviet Union who have a lot of insight about how Russia conducts influence operations, but they don't have the economic or the military power to push back against Russia? Anybody want to tackle this one?
Well, go ahead, Yaroslav, and then I'll say something.
Okay, I'm the representative of the, I would say, middle-sized small country who dealing with the Russian influence from many centuries. I would say like this, that we maintain our approach to Russia, but as I mentioned before, we have to understand how the Russia developed herself. We have to understand them more in order to build our approach with the disinformation strategy against them. Otherwise, we always will be something like the 1-2 step back.
I would just say that there are some success stories. I think if we look at what the Baltics have done in terms of fighting disinformation, if you look at the election results last year in Slovakia and in Moldova, in both those cases, both those countries made a pretty sharp turn toward the West. So this is not a hopeless situation, but it requires constant effort and support of civil society in particular.
Mm-hmm. Kathleen, do you want to mention any success stories along these lines?
So I was going to say that we've actually been working with a team in the Ukraine to actually fight disinformation and so on, and they've been very successful. I know of other groups like that in places like Romania and Slovakia, and pick your country. And the thing is that there's such strong motivation, and they just are getting together, these small groups. They then do great research on them, and then they reach out, and I think from our end, we just need to keep publishing them and getting them into the press so people can see how much is going on. But it's not a matter of needing lots of money. It's not a matter of legislation. It's a matter of internal detection and creating a within country feeling that you need to counter. And so that's been important.
Mm. That's very interesting. We have a question here about algorithms. Like, how can, in what ways do algorithms inhibit our ability to counter the algorithms of these social media companies?
Okay. So many of the algorithms will indirectly support the spread of disinformation because of their rules, their recommendation engines, their algorithms for recommendation, and their algorithms for promoting things like what gets at the top of your stack when you're in thing. So you might think, for example, if you're in Twitter, that just because you follow someone, you get all their tweets. You don't. They prioritize who gets them. And so those algorithms affect what information gets spread and how fast. And they can be tricked, which is one of the arts to spreading disinformation, which is to simply get your stuff prioritized by using more common words, etc. So that's one of the ways in which they do it. The other thing is a lot of the algorithms that are designed that people are trying to design to identify things like hate speech, disinformation, extremism action, so on. It's very hard to do those in a way that is both ethical, but that isn't prioritizing what it means to white middle-aged males in the U.S. Okay, you need more comprehensive training sets, and a lot of the training sets right now are overly focused on one group, so they're not as effective for different ethnic or religious or whatever minorities. And so we need to get our algorithms to be less biased also.
Great. Anybody else want to speak to this?
I'd like to ask a question of Kathleen, since it's rare to talk to a real expert on this kind of thing. And the question is this. A lot of people say that what we need to do through legislation or whatever is to force the social networks to publish or reveal their algorithms, and that then we'll see what's going on, and we can have a conversation and so forth. And what I imagine is that people think that if the algorithm comes out, there it'll be, line 75 says, include a lot of disinformation, true, false. And, you can fix an algorithm that quickly. My question is, what would this algorithm look like? Are we talking about, millions of lines of code with, program laced within program and different things feeding in and out of it? Does anyone really understand these algorithms, and would publishing them be useful publicly, or would it just create a new world of conspiracy theories where, did you see what line 37 says? That's where it is.
So first off, if you publish them, as soon as you publish them, they're going to be out of date because they're continuously getting updated. They are millions and millions of lines of codes, tens of millions of lines of code, but there's chains of algorithms chained together. There's ones within each other. Part of the code is legacy code from 10 generations ago. They're in multiple languages. In some sense, they're just crazy. More than publishing them, what would be more useful is to actually have something like an IRS for algorithms, like an algorithm review board that would go in and simply check, is the algorithm doing what they're claiming it's doing? Okay, because a lot of times the claims that are made about the algorithm are not consistent with what's really happening. And that can be tested on smaller parts, but just publishing it alone is not going to be helpful, I don't think.
Thank you.
Do you think that that new laws are required in the United States to deal with this problem? Maybe labeling social media companies as regulating them in the same way as news organizations. These types of domestic laws. I asked about international law, but if I could follow up with domestic laws or policy changes that you would advocate.
So I would say that we do need domestic regulation of the social media platforms in much the same way that we are also domestically regulating all of the platforms that are being used to sell Bitcoins and cryptocurrency and so on. So, to kind of level things, but we should not think that just because we have those regulations that it's going to necessarily stop disinformation, but what it will do is it will make it a more contained problem that you can then, work toward.
Thank you. Anyone else on domestic? Yeah, Jerry?
Golfo, of course, I am not the U.S. citizen, but I would say that...
Or your domestic laws.
Okay, my domestic law. I would say that, okay, the foundation of democracy is a little bit transparency and also law, right? But if you want to deal with the disinformation from Russia, we have to not be so transparent. If you want to publish this kind of law, this kind of law have to be to some level classified or to share between the community of interest or community of practice, because in otherwise we compromise our approach against, because Russia explore your website pretty well, and of course you can make some kind of disinformation publishing the wrong law. But again, take precautions against this and don't be transparent, because this culture is not transparent at all. I mean, the culture of leaders of this nation is not transparent. We read everything what we want to do, and we make the steps forward against us.
Okay, thank you. Each of you has mentioned fact-checking and getting the truth out. Could you offer your assessment of fact-checking broadly?
I think it's a very busy field, very, as I said, it's very rapidly growing. I think that it's got several problems, though. I mean, one of them, as I said, is that that fact-checking itself tends to be in a bubble. It doesn't get into the people where it can be useful. And then there are all sorts of studies. I mean, Kathleen, I think, referred to them, where, sometimes pointing out that something is false tends to fix it more in people's minds. So, I mean, I think it's, I guess, if I were running some kind of information campaign to fight disinformation, I would use fact-checking as a source, as a source of knowing what is false. But then I would convey it in much more normal street language for the particular segment that I'm targeting, with memes and cartoons and things like that, instead of these sort of scholarly-looking things that you get from most fact-checking organizations.
So I want to add that with the fact checking is an important, is an important tool in our toolkit here, but there are strong limits of it. And this is just like Tom was saying, it's because of the way disinformation is often communicated. So, for example, in the anti-vax world, one of the major storylines that is used is my girlfriend did not get her kids vaccinated and they do not have autism. That's 100%, could be 100% true, right? No fact checker is going to tell you that that's not true. But it's implies the vaccination causes autism, right? Through illogic. And so a lot of disinformation is spread by the use of illogic, by the use of anecdotes, by the use of innuendos, and increasingly by the use of memes and images, right? So during like Trident Juncture, Russia had this brilliant meme that they sent out, which showed, the Russian, head of the military, and then above it showed the head of the military of, 4 European countries, all of whom were women. And the women are sitting there looking and smiling, and the Russian guy's stern and proud, right? And, that was a disinformation story aimed largely at people not in cities that basically said, look, Russia is strong. Europe has weak military control. Disinformation, totally, but it was spread through images and understanding the local culture. So fact checking won't help us with those two kinds of problems.
Right. Jerry, do you agree? Do you want to add anything there?
Yes, I agree with this. In military world, before we reach the target, we have to build a package of information, right? And the package of information is built based on the credibility of the sources. So we have in our skills that whenever we want to check something in the information, we check this information in many different angles, from many different directions and many different way, in order to be sure that the information we want to include to our package of information before it reach the target is that one which is 100% true and lead us to the success.
Thank you. So we have another question. Is it better to know where to take the fight instead of start looking for a new battleground? The person was suggesting, will we force Russian disinformation into a new form if we regulate it too much? So I think the gist of the question is, if we go after it too overtly, are we simply making these bad actors find new and more surreptitious ways of conducting influence campaigns?
So when everyone was concerned with ISIS recruiting people through Twitter, a whole bunch of names of supposed ISIS members were given to Twitter, and they proceeded to suspend them. Those individuals then showed back up under other names. They also showed up on other platforms. When you put, in fact, a policy that pushes disinformation or actors spreading disinformation on one platform, they go to other platforms. And the ability to go across all of them at this point doesn't exist. You also find this, similar kinds of things with, I can give you hundreds of other examples, but that basic phenomena is one of the things that limits us. Well, they find, so that's a way of being surreptitious. The other thing is that an important thing about Russian disinformation campaigns in particular is that they don't need to find other forms, because they already often take what's called a scattershot approach, where they'll send out, 50 different disinformation stories and then try to see which one sticks, which one do people like. And if one of them, if you call them out on one of them, they say, oh, we were just joking. We didn't mean that, right? And that's very often, that will be an example of a strategy. So, and your laws aren't going to stop that approach.
Anyone else on this question of, if we push too hard, will there be backlash that's unintended? Anybody, Tom or Jerry?
Well, I think we should push back at threats to security. Yes, they will change into different forms, and we'll have to pursue that. But again, I would like to see us engaged in effective information operations that they have to worry about changing different forms. I mean, I don't think their IQ is larger than ours. I think the fact is that they have decided to make information a centerpiece of their warfare, and we have not.
Yeah.
Not through disinformation in our case, but through true narratives. But we just have not made a commitment. You run across this all the time with military people who will say that the amount of resources that we're devoting to information is very small compared to the amount of resources we're devoting to iron. So until the time comes when there's 4 stars running information in the military, for example, and reporting up to someone at the National Security Council who's in charge of information efforts, and you have coordination with the people in the State Department and elsewhere who are dealing with this, we are always going to be in the position of saying, well, maybe if we just leave them alone, they won't hurt us too much. I think the approach has to be that we need to be active ourselves.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so I just want to give you all, a final word. Any final thoughts? Just 1 minute, Kathleen.
So I would just say that I think that in the U.S. in particular, I agree with Tom totally. We have to be much more agile, and we have to have a more unified approach. And an example of the problem there is the fact that we have separated out intelligence from public affairs, but they both deal with information, and there's not a unified strategy across them. And without that, we're kind of crippling ourselves and not able to act agilely in response to things.
Thank you. 1 minute, Jerry.
Thank you very much, first of all, to invite me for this panel and a chance to work from the USSOCOM and to support your project. I want to say in the end that we shouldn't scare Russian, and we have to be proactive. We also have our own weakness, and we have to explore this more proactively. We have to work as a network, not by single nation, because every single nation can fail with the Russian in terms of the disinformation. So look at for the lesson learned from the Cold War, and look at for the segment of the Russian society, and use the technology, use the well-educated younger generation, and we can mitigate this problem to very low level, or to level where Russia tried to negotiate with us. Because my final optimistic sentence is that maybe this is a lot of wishful thinking, but until then, younger generation from the West absorb the Westerner culture more than the Russian and Chinese, we always win. Because I didn't hear nobody want to buy the Russian McDonald's or Russian Apple if it exists. And people still looking for the West culture as a good culture for the people, democracy. So we have to maintain this kind of feeling and education in younger generation, and we can mitigate the influence of the Russian, and after this, the Chinese.
Thank you. Tom, you have the final word.
Sure. I would just say not to panic too much about all this. I mean, obviously, this is our business, so we worry about it. But at the same time, if you look at what's happening in the world, what happened in Ukraine, what's happening now in Belarus. I referred to Moldova, Slovakia, Armenia recently, a couple of years ago. There's a tremendous movement in the world against corruption, for democratic rights. They may not call it democracy, they may just call it freedom of speech or something like that. But I don't think that long-term people are looking to live under a dictatorship, are looking to model their countries after Russia. I think one of the reasons the Russians are just so frantic in everything they do, and often, adopting contradictory strategies and so forth, is they feel themselves at a disadvantage. They feel themselves on the ropes too. Even though we feel ourselves on the ropes, they feel themselves on the ropes. So, if I had to bet as to the way things will come out, I think that the trend of human history, starting from biblical times, has been throwing off repression and fighting for freedom. And I just don't think that there's going to be a change, no matter how much, how good they get at, putting stuff on Facebook.
Well, I'm so glad you finished us off on a positive note. So as we conclude our discussion, I want to extend a sincere thank you to our wonderful panelists for taking the time to share their expertise and analysis with us. Kathleen Carley, Yaroslav Yablonsky, and Thomas Kent. Thank you so much. As was evident from this discussion today, the unique value of this forum on Russian, European, and U.S. security is that we bring together European and American perspectives, military professionals, and academics. And we will continue to do this in our final session next week. The recording of this session will be available shortly. Please join us next week for the last session in this series, which will be on comparing Russian and Chinese influence campaigns. Thank you to everyone at SOCOM and USF who made this event possible. Please stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.